This is Jim Cornette, and the views that I'm about to express are not necessarily those of anybody else but me, but they ought to be, and as a matter of fact, they probably are. You know, a lot of things in the wrestling world make me cranky these days, especially
Steve and the Scum.
You know, all the fans think these guys are so cool and so sweet and so funny. Well, as far as I'm concerned,
Steve and the Scum.
it's like a bunch of guys meeting out in the backyard in a clubhouse in a tree. They're guys who they got the easiest job in the world. All they have to do is go out there and be themselves. Childish, obnoxious, adolescent guys with a case of severe arrested emotional development and a fixation on trying to act macho.
Wrestling Inc. Radio and New World Elephant Productions present WGD Weekly with Steve and the Scum.
This week, we sit down with the Louisville Lip, Jim Cornette.
We are back. Hey there, all you savages. Welcome back to Season 2 of WGD Weekly with Steve and the Scum, Wrestling's Glory Days Weekly podcast. My name is Steve, and as always, keeping in that holiday spirit, with me by my side is jolly old Saint Scum. And if you're tuning in for the first time, this is a podcast dedicated to the glory days of pro wrestling. Myself and the Scum will have a great guest from the glory days each week, and we ask you to tune in and listen to some of the greatest storytellers in the history of professional wrestling. We try to stay away from the current product. We'll never give out any of those spoilers. Thanks once again for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show. Scum, welcome back, my brother. Did you enjoy your holiday season?
Well, yeah, I sure did, Steve. And happy holidays to you and a happy new year, my friend. I did have a nice break, and as always, for Season 2, just like Season 1, always great to be back here with you, my longtime tag team partner. I've been waiting to say that for a while. Always a pleasure to be back with our pals over at Wrestling's Glory Days on Facebook, always bringing the best in the classic era of professional wrestling. And I can't really complain too much about my holidays, my man. One item of a little concern was I was a bit worried about the whole naughty or nice deal going on. I wasn't really sure how the Scum made out this year. So when I sat down on the big man in the red suit on his lap there, turned the tables on him a little bit. You know, I asked him, hey, big man, what am I going to get for Christmas this year? And he said, so take that for what it's worth, my friend. But outside of Santa dropping the whole terminal illness bomb on me, I really can't complain. I had a pretty jolly Christmas.
Well, I guess that is pretty cool, man. I wish you all the best there. When Santa says you're going to get it, though, you better start being nice this year. That's all I got to say. But I'm glad one of us had a good season break. I was out on the shelf with a flu half the time, but we're not going to get into much more about that. Suffice it to say, enough about us. Scum, we have Jim Cornette, part 2 today. I am really excited to have him back on our show. I wager we're in for one hell of a show. I told you guys the last time that we're going to start off with a Dick Murdoch story, and I'll be damned if we don't. So we're going to kick that off right here shortly. That's right around the corner. But first, a little bit of news about, you know, what we have coming up in Season 2 and a special pairing, so to speak, Scum. So tell us all about who our new sponsor is going to be and, you know, give our listeners a little bit of insight as to what's coming up with Steve and the Scum and a major player in the wrestling internet business.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do so. We've been waiting to drop this bomb for about a month and a half since it was in the works here, Steve. First, I'd like to say happy to hear that not much has changed since Season 1 and that yourself and me, for that matter, lay down for nobody. So I'm looking forward when we get on here to you calling JC right out on that Captain Dickey story to start out. But
I'm telling you, it's happening, man.
And I know that you will. But anyway, the big news that we were waiting to drop on everyone is there's a brand new radio station on iTunes and on Stitcher with, from what I understand, and again, I'm only going by what they advertise as, the most widely viewed wrestling internet site in the world. And that's Wrestling Inc., our friends over at Wrestling Inc. So Wrestling Inc. Radio is launching a new radio station, just brand new, and one of the inaugural shows that they asked to be on is WGD Weekly with Steve and the Scum. So again, like I always say, I said it all first season, the latest sensation sweeping the wrestling radio nation. Well, again, if you can argue it, I'd welcome your feedback, but I'm pretty excited. I know you are, Steve. Big things in Season 2 here kind of played into a little bit of our decision to take the holidays off. Outside of, obviously, we wanted to spend some time with the family. But here we are. We're back. We're coming at you bigger and better than ever. And thank you very much to the people over at Wrestling Inc. for recognizing the hard work and the stuff that we've done to try and make our show grow over the course of the past 6 months since we started this whole thing. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and, making this possible. I mean, if people didn't respond and, check out the YouTube videos and jump on and download the show, I don't think that it would have been possible to be noticed by a huge entity like that. And we're pretty excited to grow even more. And who knows where this thing goes in season 2, Steve? I know one thing. I know that whole irons in the fire thing that we started out as kind of a joke. Wait till after the interview here with Jim Cornette when we can lay on you some of the upcoming schedule that we got. Because when I say bigger and better, the Scum always tells it like it is, baby. And nothing's changed there. We're talking bigger and better, my brother.
That's right. And we got a lot of goals set for ourselves this season. Just a quick review, 328 subscribers plus on Wrestling Glory Days on YouTube, so that's huge. Over 31,000 hits. That's a pretty substantial number for having just been in the, in this game, the podcasting game, so to speak, for just about 6 months, like you said, Scum, a total of 25 episodes. So good stuff there. We got 400 plus followers on Twitter. We eclipsed 1,000 followers on Facebook and over 1,000 downloads on iTunes. So we're all over the place, sweeping the wrestling radio nation, as you say, Scum. Really excited and looking forward to season 2. But, going back real quick and talking about Wrestling Inc., it's one of the biggest and best wrestling websites out there. So go check it out now. Get all your information from Wrestling Inc., some great stuff over there. We are going to be a part of a station that brings you a variety of wrestling podcasts. So if you're really interested in the Glory Days, classic professional wrestling, you can rely on Steve and the Scum. We're going to bring that to you each and every week. We also got a couple other partners there. We're not going to announce them just yet because I don't think they're quite ready to make their presence known. But we do have a variety, like we said, modern stuff, talking about week to week, the new episodes of Monday Night Raw. I'm sure there's going to be some shows on there dedicated simply to that. So we look forward to being part of a great team at Wrestling Inc. Radio. Moving on, Steve and the Scum getting bigger and bigger. But let's move on to talking about a couple other things here, Scum. We got Jim Cornette. Let's move on to what's in store after the Jim Cornette interview, Scum. I know you've been working on a little project here recently with myself and a couple other admins. So tell our listeners about what you've got in store for us after the Jim Cornette interview.
All right, Steve, be happy to. What we were putting our heads together as to what we wanted to do here with our big comeback, episode 1, season 2. Obviously, Jim Cornette, Part 2 is one that everybody was waiting for, and the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, as of 2 days ago, the Jim Cornette interview alone had seen over 4,500 people check it out on YouTube, not to mention another 100-plus downloads through iTunes. So almost 5,000 people tuned into the Part 1, which was our most listened-to program in the first season. I was looking at some of the numbers in our break here, Steve, and I'm happy to announce, kind of humbled to announce that we had over 10 shows that reached in excess of 1,000 views, meaning over 1,000 people watched 10 of our shows, and the Mark Merrow one is quickly approaching that same mark. So, I mean, some of the other ones that were just flabbergasting numbers, the Larry Zbyszko episode with the shot heard around the world when he made the comments about TNA wrestlers being on food stamps, and he kind of took a swipe at Sting. Our two-parter with Ken Shamrock with the whole blackballed incident, and then he dropped the line on why he thought he was blackballed, that Hunter and a few of the boys had shit and Mark Henry's sandwich. Alex Wright was a surprising big number, up over 2,000, 2,300 hits for he talked on Chris Benoit and a few other things. Of course, the Buff Bagwell interview where he talked about his meeting with Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff backstage at TNA, Lex Luger, Road Warrior Animal, Jake the Snake Roberts, Diamond Dallas Page, Scott Hudson, all of those shows up over 1,000 views on YouTube, not to mention each of them were right around 100 to 150 downloads on iTunes. Just kind of flabbergasting to me. But anyway, what we're getting at after the program here is we decided to do a take on the old year-end awards. I know we're all big fan of the old Pro Wrestling Illustrated Year in Review, but our year-end rewards are going to be just focused on WGD Weekly. So we have 5 topics that we'll be bringing to you, where Steve and I will select our favorites in each category for certain awards that we made up, and a few of the admins over at Wrestling's Glory Days were nice enough to chime in too. So right after our part 2 with our most viewed guest of the first season, Jim Cornette, we'll hit you with WGD Weekly, the year in review.
Oh, that sounds excellent, Scum. I think it's cool to see the numbers for season 1. Which one of our guests was the most listened to? I think we all knew it was going to be Jim Cornette. And, I think we should tell our listeners which ones were our favorites as well. Maybe throw out a couple of New Year's resolutions sure to go wrong. Who knows? So stay tuned, all you savages. All this and much more right around the corner. But right now, we're about to hop on the Cornette Express. We're going to be right back right after this.
Yo, monkeys, it's me. It's DDT, the king of bada bing, the master of diamond color, the three-time world champion. And you, for you monkeys, you're listening to WGD Weekly with Steve and the Scum.
All right, folks, the moment y'all been waiting for. I know I've been waiting for it. One of my favorite performers of all time. We got Jim Cornette back on the line with us. Thanks so much for joining us, Jim. You got a great-looking website now, real good facelift. And on that website, you have a picture of yourself in what seems to be maybe one of the biggest memorabilia collections, one of the biggest professional wrestling memorabilia collections that I've ever seen. So that's fantastic. So how's it been going? How's that new website working out for you?
Well, we've been getting a lot of great feedback on the website, and I thank you very much. My wife, the lovely Mrs. C, has worked hard on it. We had somebody build the I don't even know what I'm talking about when it comes to websites. I don't even know what he did, but we had somebody build the foundation, and then she has prettied everything up and painted and fixed up and cleaned up, as my old friend Jimmy Hart would say. And we've got a lot of great features. If you want to read about professional wrestling, my columns that I do for Fighting Spirit magazine, the largest fighting sports magazine in the United Kingdom. The back columns are on there, archived. Also, my Cornette's commentaries. You can get a look at my vault, my historically large collection of wrestling memorabilia. There's actually a section you can go to and click on from the vault where you get to see some of my prized possessions, along with a few little personal anecdotes about them. And also, I don't have just the world's biggest wrestling collection. I got one of the world's biggest collections, period. Comic books and horror movie magazines and toys and games and puzzles and, just a variety of things I've picked up in my travels since I was a kid. And we're going to be featuring a lot of that stuff on the site. Also, of course, you can shop the Cornette's Collectibles section for my Midnight Express book, my new book on Memphis wrestling merchandising, rags, paper, and pens. We've got some cool videos, some collectors magazines up there. We're about to set up a gallery section where you can see pictures of, me from various stages in my career. I'm just really excited about it. And, of course, it all centers around my new podcast. I don't mean to be, it's not personal, guys. I'm not trying to run you out of business. But with the major domo of MLW Radio, Court Bauer, we've launched the Jim Cornette Experience. It's a new podcast that starts airing every Thursday morning on MLW Radio. You can go to MLW.com, or you can just go to my website, JimCornette.com. Did we mention that enough? JimCornette.com, and it's got a button that you can click on and take you right to the current podcast. So many things going on. And, of course, the news broke last week about my first ever tour of the United Kingdom that's coming up in February, and I'm really looking forward to that because believe it or not, and some people are shocked at this, but I have never appeared live anywhere but the continental United States and Canada in over a 30-year professional wrestling career. So this will be a first on a number of levels. For anybody listening, once again, you can go to JimCornette.com. Did I mention that enough? And get information about the UK tour. Or if you're over in the British Isles, as they say, you can go to jimcornettelive.co.uk and get tickets and information for the various one-man shows, meet and greets, VIP dinners, wrestling school seminars, all kinds of good stuff that I'm going to be doing the last couple of weeks of February over in the United Kingdom.
That is great. It's a great time when you're always able to do something, even after a long career, to be able to kind of go into uncharted water, so to speak. So that's really cool. But I'll tell you, Jim.
Well, now don't say it that way, because one of the reasons why I've never been overseas is I hate to fly, and I don't want to fly 8 hours in a metal tube over an ocean 5 miles in the air at 500 miles an hour. But now you're saying I'm going into uncharted waters. That's what I'm afraid of. I'm going to an unfamiliar airport. Let's put it that way. I don't want to know what my final destination is. That's it. I don't know why they named it Terminal. The whole airport experience is stressful for me, but I'm taking Mrs. C, and I'm going to be Xanaxed, and she's going to lead me around by the hand, and the folks at Wrestle Talk TV are going to take over once we get there.
That is awesome. Well, we're not going to let you off the hook here. When you were on our show last time, we were talking about some spots that you were in, some territories that you worked in. Of course, so many great, memorable feuds and territories that you worked in, but we wanted you to, and you committed to it, so we're going to hold you to your word. We're going to start you off right where we left off the last time, and let's talk about one of our favorite guys here on the show. We try to get him in as much as we can just because he's no longer with us, and he was one of our favorite guys growing up. One of my all-time favorites was Captain Redneck, Dick Murdoch. So why don't we get into our show with talking about a couple of great stories about old Captain Redneck?
Well, I love Dickie Murdoch also because he was such an entertaining guy. As a matter of fact, for a while there in the late 90s, Vince McMahon hired Dick to come up, and I think he made a couple of appearances, but he came to like 6 months worth of TVs. I think everybody just wanted him to be there just to tell stories in catering. I first got a chance to work with Dick, in Jim Crockett Promotions in the 80s, and managed him for a while along with the Midnight Express. And I remember one night in Baltimore, he was booked in a single match against Nikita Koloff, and at the time, having a match with Nikita Koloff, having a good match with Nikita Koloff was not the easiest thing to do. With Dusty and Nikita as a team, or Nikita and Magnum and their heated program, the matches were classic. But just a cold match with Nikita Koloff was not a night off. Let's put it that way. And Dick was kind of sitting there thinking, "What am I going to do?" And I knew how to get to him because Dick was the best worker in the world when he was motivated. When he wasn't, sometimes he might take a night off. And I said, "Dick, you know that everybody thinks this match is going to suck." And they were going 20 minutes time limit draw. I said, "You know everybody thinks this match is going to suck." I said, "Why don't you go out there and show these kids how to have a great match?" I said, "You're probably the only one that can do it, Dickie. You're the only one that can have a great 20-minute time limit draw in a cold match with Nikita Koloff." And by the time we got out there, he was bumping and flying and feeding and making those faces, and they tore the house down for 20 minutes. It was the best Nikita Koloff match I've ever seen in my life. So he taught a lot of guys something. Of course, he taught me something several years later when he came to work for me in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Actually, I believe at the time that he was also going up to the WWF, and so were the Heavenly Bodies. So we got back from a show in Eastern Kentucky one night, and we were all flying out. We were at the Charlotte airport. We were all flying out the next morning, and we were only going to be at the hotel for 3 or 4 hours. So Tom Pritchard gets his room, Jimmy Del Rey gets his room, I get my room, and Dick said, "Well, Corny, I'll come up with you with a sandwich." He sat there and started telling me stories, but it was like 3 in the morning. We had to get up at 7. And finally I said, "Dick," I said, I just have to go to sleep. I said, why don't you take this money and go down and get you a room where you can take a nap for a while?" "Okay." And he took off. So he not only taught me how to have a great match with Nikita Koloff, but he taught me how to get somebody else to pay for a hotel room when he didn't want to do it.
That is good stuff. Good stuff. Well, we've had a few guests recently that had some stories. Ted DiBiase specifically comes to mind, where he said we talked about them working out in Kansas City and the Missouri State title, and he said him and Murdoch were pretty much the only two. He said normally the Missouri State title would lead to the NWA World title. So, but Murdoch had the talent, but they didn't know if he was going to be out there, entertaining the boys or entertaining the crowd. He said sometimes he'd do the Three Stooges stuff, and he said he'd still be a hell of a match, but he'd get ever in.
I had a handicap match with him as my partner against Bullet Bob Armstrong one night. And every time, of course, he did most of the work, obviously, but I was standing on the apron there, and every time that he hit the ropes near me, he would start a line of a joke. And they went into this complicated high spot, which required him to hit the ropes about 6 or 7 times, and every time he hit the rope near me, he would say another line of the joke, and finally Bob backdropped him, and he gave me the punchline while he was upside down in the backdrop. And nobody knew what was going on. The fans couldn't tell any difference. He was a natural. He was amazing. But, stories about him and Dusty Rhodes traveling, they actually, when they worked for Vern Gagne as the Texas Outlaws in the early 70s, they had an apartment they shared together, and from the stories I've heard, the third roommate was a mule. They had a mule in the apartment. I don't know why. I don't know how it came to be, but people actually saw it. And another time we were in Chicago for Jim Crockett, and we got in real late at night and got into the private airport. That's when Crockett had his plane, which was Midway at the time. And 30 years ago, the Midway Airport was not as built up. The area around it not as built up as it was now. So we get in at 3 o'clock in the morning from some show somewhere for an afternoon show the next day at the UIC Pavilion, and somebody's forgotten to get us rental cars. There's no rental cars to be had. And there's no hotel rooms to be had because we had made reservations at O'Hare Airport that we thought we were going to. So they got us all one cab for 16 wrestlers, made about 4 or 5 trips, and we ended up at the Airliner Motel. Boy, I tell you what, it looked like something off American Horror Story. There was the guy behind the desk, had a lazy eye, and he was kind of weird looking. And then he said, "Oh, I'll rent you this room. We've got 4 of them left." Well, that's great because we need 4. "I'll rent you this room, but it needs some sheets." And he rings the bell, and a guy that looked like he was wearing one of those scrub outfits they give the patients in a mental asylum shuffled in and brought some sheets, gave them to Stan Lane. And they had one room with no door lock. You could lock it on the inside, but you couldn't lock it on the outside. So Stan took that one. They had another room, Bobby took that one. Another room, Dick Murdoch took that one. And another room, I took that one. And we get up in the rooms, and immediately I look around, and I think, oh, my God, I hear screaming from next door. And it's a woman screaming. I'm like, oh, my God, something's going on here. But then I turned the TV on to cover the screams up and found out that it was the in-house black and white porno channel. Stan, meanwhile, come to find out from him later on, he had pushed the door open of his room and broke down in a karate stance in case there was any crack deals going on in the unlocked room. And so I'm looking around my room, and I'm going to call Bobby, right? I'm going to call Bobby and see, what the heck his room looks like. So I pick up the phone, and there's no dial tone. And then I look, and the little red button, where a little red light, where it used to be a message light, is just a hole. And there's no dial. There's no, it's a rotary dial telephone, but there's no dial on it. So I assume this phone doesn't work, so I'm sitting there trying not to touch anything. And about 10 minutes later, the phone rings. And I think, oh, my God, I've seen this horror movie, right? The voice on the other end is going to go, "You must come with me." So I pick up the phone and go, "Hello? It's Bobby." I said, "Bobby, my phone doesn't work. How did you call me?" He said, "Oh, when you pick it up, you got to wait for the guy in the desk on the switchboard to patch you through to something. There's no way to dial." Okay. He said, "Corny, what's your room like?" I said, "Well, I've seen better." He said, "Well, my room's got 3 beds in it, and none of them match, and one of them's broke down and leaned up in the corner." So anyway, we're all miserable. We don't sleep in this place. We don't know what's going on. The next day, we come down at checkout time of noon, so we can get over to the UIC Pavilion by 1 o'clock for the 2 o'clock show, and Murdoch comes in whistling, just as happy as a clam, and we said, "Dick, did you sleep in this hotel?" "Oh, yeah, I slept like a baby." I said, "Weren't you worried about this place?" He said, "Hell, are you kidding me? Me and Rhodes, one time, we checked in a hotel one night, and when I woke up the next morning, I had 3 inches of snow on my chest." Of course, they had been drinking and opened the window to get a little fresh air, and he nodded off right at the window, and that's how that happened. But still,
great stuff.
Dick Murdoch. And by the way, anybody out there within the sound of my voice that has the opportunity to vote in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, vote for Dick Murdoch. Dick Murdoch should be in the Hall of Fame. I vote for him every year, and I'm going to do that until either he gets in or I die.
Well, you got a couple of votes here. We always love to hear. We've heard some great stuff. You're certainly not the only one. A couple of our recent guests there, but keeping on the same theme of some classic characters from wrestling's glory days that had a reputation for having a good sense of humor or maybe even some ribbing. We wanted to see for a story if you had a story or two from your time in your WWF days. Man who certainly had that reputation, the late great Owen Hart. Do you have any funny stories from the road or
Backstage.
Oh God,
backstage
well, there's been so many. Owen was a great phone ribber. As a matter of fact, if you've got Mick Foley's first book, at least, it might have been in more, but the first book, Have a Nice Day. And by the way, I'm leaving here shortly to go have lunch with Mick Foley and go see his show at the Comedy Caravan tonight in Louisville, Kentucky. By the time people hear this, it may be too late, but if you're around the Comedy Caravan in Louisville, come see Mick Foley, and I'll be doing his Q&A with him. But anyway, Owen was a great phone ribber. He would jack people out of bed in the middle of the night saying it was the front desk and they needed to do this or that or the other thing and just get them all wound up. But one story that backfired on me that I thought it was, they were playing ha-ha with me was, Owen and Davey together, Davey Boy Smith, were like two children that they just had to top each other. I mean, we'd do promos and we'd be standing there in front of the camera and all of a sudden I'd look to the left of me and Owen all of a sudden was 2 inches taller than both me and Davey because we were all three kind of the same height. And you'd look down, he'd be standing on a roll of duct tape. And then you'd look back over, and Bulldog would be about 3 inches taller, and he'd be standing on a box. And then I'd look down because I'd feel something, and while we were concentrated on standing there for the camera, Owen had one of those spray bottles, and he would squirt the front of my pants where it looked like I'd pissed myself on camera. But one day we were at a Raw taping in somewhere, I can't remember where, but we were back in the locker room or one of the production areas, and Owen and Davey both come in with a smile on their face, and they bring this red phone. It looks like the Commissioner Gordon bat phone, right? This red phone with a cord trailing to the next room, supposedly. It looked like they brought me a phone, right? And they said, Jim, it's a phone for you. I said, who is it? It's Stu. He wants to talk to you. Now, this was at the time where Davey Boy was working with Shawn Michaels, and the story had gotten out that Shawn had tried to molest or attack or hit on or whatever Diana, Davey's wife. And we were making a big deal out of that, and Shawn was proclaiming his innocence. So I take this phone, and it's supposedly Stu, right? And I said, hello, and the voice said, Jim, is this you? Yeah, Stu, how are you? I'm good, but I just want to know what's going on with this thing with Diana and Shawn. It makes Diana look like some kind of whore. The kids, they got to go to school and they see this on TV where, some way or another she looks like a whore. Well, now there's Owen and Davey standing in front of me smiling, so I figure there's a guy in the company that does a great Stu Hart impression, and it's Bruce Pritchard. And obviously what they have done is they have got him on the other line, on the other end of the phone somewhere, wherever they've got this phone, and he's yanking my chain, right? So I said, well, Stu, I agree with you. I said, it does make Diana look bad, and I said, I didn't have anything to do with this. It was all that Bruce Pritchard. I said, because, he's a sexual deviant and a pervert. He goes to a lot of these peep shows and, buys these sex toys, and he's horrible, and he came up with the whole thing. He wants to make the whole thing porno wrestling, and I'm just against it. So I agree with you. Well, we get to do something about it because it's making Diana look like a whore. I said, well, I really don't have the power to do anything. I guess I'm going to have to call Vince. I said, that's what you ought to do. You ought to call Vince. You ought to tell him, hey, this Bruce Pritchard is a pervert, and he's doing the Hart family no good, and this has to come to a stop, and you should probably even fire the guy. Just tell Vince that. Well, okay, I always liked Bruce, but, I just can't have Diana looking like a whore. I said, well, I appreciate you calling, Stu. Sorry I didn't have better news for you. All right, thank you. Boom, click, hang up. And I asked Owen and Davey, I said, who was that? And they said, it was Stu. It was Stu. And just then, literally, instantly, Bruce Pritchard walks in the room, obviously knowing nothing about what's going on. And then I realized that I had just, for the first time ever, Owen Hart had given somebody a telephone for a rib and actually told them the real person they were talking to. I was talking to Stu Hart. and Bruce didn't get fired, but I'm sure that Vince got an interesting phone call from Stu.
But that was
you couldn't. I mean,
if
Owen or Dave, either one, if they came to you and gave you $1 million, you'd be looking for the printing press. It had to be a rib. It got to the point where they ribbed so much that nobody would believe anything.
That's great. That's great stuff. Now, you spent a lot of time in that creative department in WWF when there were some really interesting characters going on, some legendary, just bad gimmicks, so to speak. And now we've all heard your take on what they wanted to do with Leon White, Big Van Vader, and you were adamantly against it. And we all know those 3 crazy words that you used in another interview. You know, it's fucking Vader. That said, it's got to be one of my favorite quotes. And again, now I'm not a huge fan of like looking up all the dirt on the internet. It gets a little redundant, but I always go out of my way for Jim Cornette because you can throw some color onto it and make it interesting. But when we're talking about that type of a subject matter with changing guys' names, and there's other guys out there too, Dusty Rhodes, Barry Windham, just to think of 2 guys, Ron Simmons, another guy that, I think they just got labeled with some bad gimmicks and did their best with it in WWF. But while you were there, talk to us a little bit about some of the gimmicks that either didn't make the cut or they were just so terribly bad that you didn't even know how to approach it.
I've put a lot of that stuff out of my mind, like post-traumatic stress disorder. But that was the thing, and we lost the fight with, I always thought, I said, why are you changing Cactus Jack's name? But Mankind worked, because let's face it, you could call Mick Foley, Styles Bitchley, and he would still figure out a way to get over because he was a great talent. And Vader narrowly missed becoming the Mastodon. But I understand that they wanted to change everyone's name so they'd own the marketing and merchandising rights. And I've changed some guys' names in my tenure as booker in various places also. But, and I don't think that the Crusher would have been as feared as he was if he'd have stuck with his original birth name of Reggie Lasowski. So sometimes you need to change a guy's name or change a guy's gimmick, but I never understood changing a name or a gimmick of a guy who was a household name in wrestling. It'd be like, okay, Sony Records just signed the Rolling Stones away from, EMI, so we're going to change their name. Instead of calling them the Rolling Stones, we're going to call them Gravel and Moss or something. Right. That, to me, is nonsensical, because when you have that newspaper ad or you have that advertising, you don't want to take a guy with a household name and change his name and put up a name that nobody knows. And, of course, their egotistical outlook on it was that, well, we're the biggest company and our television makes stars and et cetera, but, everybody knew who Cactus Jack was. Everybody knew who Vader was. Everybody knew who, for heaven's sake, Terry Funk was when he was Chainsaw Charlie, even though that was his idea. I think he was afraid that he might get some on him if he came in as Terry Funk.
Right.
But, in some cases, changing guys' names and changing their gimmick, that's part of things, but when you take a guy that's a household name to wrestling fans and change it, I thought that was counterproductive. But, of course, you had a guy like Kevin Dunn, the, executive producer of the television, who just refused to consider that any other professional wrestling wasn't taking place in a barn at a county fair somewhere, and the WWF was the big leagues, which at the time, especially in the 80s and 90s, they had a lot of competition. Now it might be correct, but in those days it wasn't, but he still thought it was because he wasn't a wrestling fan. He was just a miserable human being who was always unhappy about something.
Gotcha. Well, regardless of there being some of that crazy stuff that went on there, I mean, you're definitely, with myself and with Steve, I know I can speak for him, one of the best creative minds, one of the most respected creative minds that the business has ever seen. So if you wouldn't mind at your time working there on the creative side in WWF, what were some of the storylines or ideas that you had that we actually saw play out, or that you were proud of, or maybe one or two that you thought would have been gold that maybe didn't make it to TV?
Well, in the way that we worked even then, even when it was just myself, Bruce Pritchard, and Vince, it's Vince's show. So you throw in ideas. You throw in, we could do this, or he could say that, or we could book this match, or we could have this finish. But everything was a group effort. So I'm not trying to shift any of the heat, but I'm not trying to take any of the credit either. Although I will say that some of the stuff that I was proudest of was they kind of left me alone with Kane during his initial introduction and subsequent hunt for his first match with The Undertaker. The idea was mine for Hell in a Cell because I simply stole the big cage that they had used in Memphis, where Tommy Rich famously hid under the cage for 8 hours so he could come out in the match with Lawler and Austin Idol. And you couldn't come out from under the ring and get into the cage unless the cage surrounded the ringside area too, so they made a big cage. And then I stole the top on the cage from the War Games that Dusty had. When you steal from one person, it's plagiarism. When you steal from many, it's research. So the Hell in a Cell match was originally, the concept was it was a big cage that surrounds the ringside area, which I stole from Memphis, and a top on it, which I stole from the War Games, so nobody can get in, nobody can get out, but there's plenty of room for people to do their stuff. And they wanted to introduce Kane in the Shawn Michaels and Undertaker match, which was the first Hell in a Cell match in St. Louis, and I stole something else from Kevin Sullivan. I said, when Kane comes out, the referee is down, everybody's down, and then all of a sudden the red lighting hits and the music plays, and here comes Kane, the brother of The Undertaker that has been teased but up until now has not been seen, and he rips the door off the cage because that's the way that Kevin Sullivan introduced Doug Furnace, the world's strongest man, on a Christmas night event in Knoxville, Tennessee, when Doug Furnace had been a big UT football player and a star there, and everybody knew who he was. He came to rescue the baby faces, and the world's strongest man ripped the door off the cage. So Kane, conversely, coming in to get The Undertaker, rips the door off the cage, which automatically makes him look like a monster. They have the face-to-face. He tombstones The Undertaker. Shawn Michaels goes over. But it was a way to get The Undertaker out of the program with Shawn and into something else because he wasn't going to get the last word on Shawn Michaels. And let's face it, you can't just leave The Undertaker laying there as Reeser Bowden in Mid-South Wrestling would say, like a plate full of piss. You had to give him some reason why he wasn't continuing to go after little bitty Shawn Michaels and break him in half. Right. So then, Kane coming out and trying to, the blood will be on your hands. Undertaker didn't want to fight his brother. Well, the blood will be on your hands, Undertaker, because Kane is going to destroy everybody in his path until he forces you to fight him. And then finally the ultimate occurrence of that was when they'd be having matches and the red lighting would go and the music would play and the flames would blow and Kane would come out and just kill everybody in the ring until finally it was a 6-man Mexican mini match with Sonny as the referee. and the music hits and all the little minis just scattered everywhere and Sonny's trying to find it like a rat trying to find a corner in a silo, doesn't know where to go, and then it was just, that's organic comedy to me in wrestling, where nobody actually did anything really silly or stupid or tried to be bad actors and recite bad comedy material. The people just got off on the fact that they've seen this guy destroy all these people, and now of all matches, and it was funny. It was fucking funny, but it wasn't silliness per se.
Sure.
Right. Well, that's the difference between a creative mind and a pizza guy. And the reason I say that is because we had Larry Zbyszko on not too long ago, and he touched on a gentleman by the name of Jim Hurd, who by all accounts, his ideas completely ridiculed over the years. And I think that not only Zbyszko but Ric Flair have both been adamant about the man selling pizza long before he ever did anything in wrestling. So you had the unfortunate opportunity, I think, to cross paths with him, and we all know, and anybody that's listening to our show and has heard anything about Jim Cornette can always, certainly very vocal about the team of Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara. Certainly.
Well, you're jumping ahead and you're idiots now, because we've just glossed over Jim Hurd. He gets almost a chapter, almost a full chapter in my book, The Midnight Express 25th Anniversary Scrapbook, which was the Wrestling Observer Book of the Year a few years ago, and is still available at JimCornette.com. But the best stupid idea that Jim Hurd, and there's so many of them, we could go on and on, but the best one I ever heard was when he wanted to introduce the team of the Hunchbacks. I'm sitting there in a room, and Flair had already quit as booker, and I was shortly to follow, but I was still there. But I was sitting there in a room with Jim Barnett, Jim Ross, Jim Hurd, Kevin Sullivan, myself, Jody Hamilton, gosh, I'm trying to think who else. Terry Funk may or may not have been there, and Ole Anderson. And Jim Hurd goes on this 10-minute soliloquy where he starts talking about how he's come up with the greatest idea for a tag team ever, the Hunchbacks. They got the big hump on their back, and you get them in there and you can't pin them. You can't pin them because they got the hump on their back, so you can't get both their shoulders down at the same time. So they're an unbeatable tag team, and that's the way we'll sell them. You can't beat these guys because they've got humps on their backs. And for 10, and he was deadly serious, because remember, the Ding Dongs made it to television, and that was heard, and they made it to TV. So he was deadly serious about this. And finally, Ole let him get it all out of his system, and then Ole, bless him, the wrestling's cantankerous old man, he said, "All right, Jim, tell you what, you book the Hunchbacks, build them up, they're undefeated. Then you book them with me and Arn. As soon as I tag in, I'm going to take one of them down. I'm going to slap an arm bar on him. I'm going to make him submit. He's going to give up. I just beat your unbeatable team." Well, God damn it, Ole, you know what I mean. I'm trying to And thankfully, the Hunchbacks did not make their appearance in WCW, but by the time Hurd got finished with WCW, it wouldn't have really mattered anyway. That's why, to be perfectly honest, that Vince won the war was because from the end of 1988 till I believe it was the beginning of 1991 or 2, was it? How long did he last? I think like 3 years. Jim Hurd was in charge of WCW and gave Vince a giant 3-year head start on that race that they were never able to overcome. I mean, Eric Bischoff accidentally did something right for 2 years and then put him out of business, but it was literally 8 years after TBS bought the company before they were able to turn a profit, and you can trace it back to the 3 years of ineptitude that Jim Hurd started them off with.
Someone down there must have been a big fan of the personal pan meat.
No, actually, the way Hurd got his job, I guess we just assume that everybody knows, he had been an executive with Pizza Hut in St. Louis. And his wrestling background was in the 1960s. He had been a studio director at KPLR TV, where Sam Muchnick did his wrestling show. So he directed an hour of wrestling a week back when you didn't even smarten up the TV crew to what was going on, and that was his wrestling background. But his wife, apparently, as they tell the story, as they like to say down south, as the story goes, Hurd's wife and Jack Petrick's wife, the TBS executive bigwig that was over the department or the part of Turner Broadcasting that oversaw WCW, their wives were friends. So obviously at some hen party, Petrick's wife had said to Hurd's wife, "Well, your husband used to do wrestling TV, didn't he?" "Oh, yes." "Well, then, Jack, hire this guy." And that's legitimately, as best as we can determine, how Jim Hurd got that job. And I ain't lying. I wish I was. I wish I was making that shit up.
Absolutely. So before we move on to a little more serious stuff, Steve had also brought up any memories. I'm sure they wouldn't be so fond of similar booking meetings or creative meetings that you could recall from that Attitude Era, where I know a lot of stuff did make it to TV that was pretty over the top, but with the Russo-Ferrara team?
Oh, well, thank God I was gone by the time that Ferrara came in. I was gone off the creative team. I was still working there for the company, but I had to spend 11 months in the same room with Vince Russo and Vince McMahon that's where I really got to hate life in general. Because, you know, when it was me and Bruce Pritchard and Vince McMahon is a fun guy in certain circumstances, and, you know, Bruce was an old friend of mine, but then they put Bruce in the office and brought Russo on the writing team, and at first it was sort of like the Donald Pleasance line in the original Halloween. For the first 6 years, I tried to reach him. And then I spent the next 8 trying to make sure that he would never escape being locked up, because what I saw behind those eyes was purely and simply evil. For the first several months, I thought, okay, you know, he's a nice, energetic, you know, enthusiastic guy who doesn't know anything about wrestling. We're going to try to teach him. Then I figured out he didn't want to learn because he thought that he knew what the fuck he was doing and that we were all crazy. I'm talking about Russo, and that he wasn't ever going to learn anything about wrestling and didn't want to. And then I made it my life's mission to somehow keep anything that he did from actually seeing the light of day to the detriment of the wrestling business. And finally it got to the point where all we did was just argue with each other. You know, Kane, classic example. He comes out and he tombstones The Undertaker in his debut, and then the next week, Russo wanted Kane to choke slam The Undertaker through the announcer's desk. I said, now, wait a minute. It's October. Vince McMahon says they're first going to fight each other in March at WrestleMania. That's 6 months. Now, Undertaker only wanting to fight, not wanting to fight his brother, will only go so far. If Kane does something to The Undertaker every goddamn week, then after a few weeks, people are going to be saying, look, Undertaker, you need to fight this guy, or else why you're a big 7-foot pussy. And the last thing we need is a 7-foot pussy named The Undertaker. So let him do it to other people and get The Undertaker that way, and they let me get by with that one. But Russo's problem, besides the fact that he's from New York and he's the worst stereotype of just a goddamn obnoxious Yankee, is also that he was not a wrestling fan. He watched wrestling and liked angles and liked gimmicks. And he wasn't enough of a wrestling fan to watch and understand that all those things he saw as a child, Piper hitting Jimmy Snuka with a coconut or whatever, those things happened every few months, and then you followed up on them, and they made sense when you did them because you had told the story beforehand leading up to why these people would do these things. All Russo remembered, because he had the attention span of a fucking junkie with a clicker on a morphine drip, was the actual incidents themselves. So he wanted to write 2-hour television shows full of people hitting each other over the head with coconuts. And fucking, he loved the Jerry Springer show, and he thought that the wrestling fans' IQ was that of a flea, and their attention span was like his, and all they wanted to see was just mayhem and chaos and carnage. And he didn't believe in baby faces and heels, because there's no such thing as good people and bad people. Everybody knows that, fucking idiot. And, you know, so he put matches together where people didn't know who to fucking cheer. They didn't know whose side who was on. It was constantly, and in TNA, where he didn't have Vince McMahon to edit him and calm him down, it was even worse. That's why you would see those impacts where it would go from people screaming at each other on an interview to people brawling in the arena to people brawling backstage by the dressing room trailers to women brawling in the fucking bathroom to more people screaming at each other. And by the end of the show, you didn't know what the fuck had gone on, and you didn't care about anybody. You know, Vince Russo doesn't get people over. He gets them under. I've said that before. But that was the problem. Russo remembered all these great highlights in his little pea brain that he had seen growing up watching wrestling, but he didn't understand why they were done, how they were led up to, and how they were followed up on. And so as a result, all you got was the trailer for the movie. And you can make a really great-looking 1-minute trailer out of a really stinky 2-hour movie. We've seen that before, too. That's been proven. But he didn't know how to write the fucking movie. He only knew how to write the trailer. And that was his biggest problem. And, you know, he lucks into a spot where you've got Steve Austin and The Rock coming up at the same time, the two biggest stars in the history of modern wrestling, in the history of wrestling, period. And at that point, you couldn't fuck it up. You got Steve Austin and The Rock on top, and you got Vince McMahon, who plays a great heel, because he can be a great heel. He's not playing. Those three personalities, you could have read cooking recipes on the rest of the show, so all that stupid fucking shit that he did, was they were watching Steve Austin, The Rock, and Mr. McMahon, and they put up with the rest of it. And then he goes to WCW and bankrupts them in 2 years. And then he goes to TNA and fixes it so that, they've spent tens of millions of dollars of Dixie's daddy's money, and they're worse off now than they were when they were on Fox Sports on Thursday afternoon, because people saw that product for so long and said it's never going to get any better, and we've given up hope, and now it is what it is. So Russo pretty much had a cup of coffee in the WWF where he came up with a few good ideas and took credit for everything else. He then followed that up with bankrupting the most well-funded wrestling company in the history of the world. And then he destroys Vince McMahon's only competition to the point where a lot of people in TNA at various points in time thought that Vince McMahon was still paying Vince Russo to not come back to the WWF. As a matter of fact, Bill Watts did that. Bill Watts was on the outs one time with one of his longest friends and right-hand men, Grizzly Smith. And Grizzly Smith, since he couldn't work for Mid-South Wrestling, took a job for the group promoted by the Curtis family in Mississippi. And he was the booker there. And their business was the shits because Grizzly was a great agent and a famous wrestling personality, was not a good booker. And so finally Grizzly called Bill up and said, Bill, I'd really like to come back to work. And Watts basically said, how about this? You just stay there and keep doing the job you're doing, and I'll send you a check that matches theirs. So he paid the guy to stay there and do his best booking for the opposition because he knew what a shitty job he was doing, and sooner or later they'd go out of business, and that's what happened. And then he took Grizzly back.
Smart man.
There was supposition in a number of quarters for quite some time that Vince McMahon was paying Vince Russo to stay in TNA because it was better for the WWF business. But unfortunately, that's not the case because for some unknown reason, Jeff Jarrett, who I love the Jarrett family, love Jeff, love his father, dearly loved his grandmother, Jeff Jarrett liked Vince Russo, and so he sabotaged his own company from the start by bringing the guy in, and it's never recovered. But enough of the bad thing.
I was just going to say, enough with the creative side of the ridiculous, so to speak, because the next couple of questions we wanted to talk about what we would consider, some feathers in your cap, so to speak. Show, like I said earlier, one of the most respected minds ever in the wrestling business. First, we wanted to touch on what was one of the final attempts, the actual successful attempts at territory in wrestling, you would say, in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Could you take us to how you decided or the thought process coming up with Smoky Mountain? Why you think it's still so well received by the old school fans, even today, the old footage, and who at that time in Smoky Mountain from that roster do you recall that you knew would come into their own and become a star, and who do you think maybe could have been a star that never quite had the chance?
Well, first of all, gosh, this would be a show, but I'll try to give you the capsule review. My last year or year and a half in WCW, I'd be riding in the car with the Midnight Express, Bobby and Stan, and I was so miserable working there, and the business was bad. Jim Hurd was in charge. We were on the outs because he didn't like the Midnight Express and me when he first came in because we had one of the bigger contracts in the company, and they couldn't figure out why, just because we'd drawn all that money. But anyway, so I knew it was only a matter of time at some point we were going to be out of there. And when we would go to Knoxville for WCW shows, I would see that despite the fact that the house show crowds were down drastically in almost every other market, and the people that were there didn't really like most of the shit that they were seeing on the shows, Knoxville still was drawing great crowds, and it was an appreciative crowd, and they enjoyed wrestling. And I said, the old Knoxville territory with the Tri-Cities, Johnson City and Kingsport and Eastern Kentucky, all those great, small towns, they love wrestling up in the hills and et cetera. Then maybe extended out to Asheville, North Carolina, that whole Smoky Mountain region. Those are some great wrestling towns. And so finally, of course, WCW ended up killing Knoxville too because of 7 no-shows on a card because they had guys on guaranteed contracts. They'd get a hangnail or a sprained taint, wouldn't want to wrestle. But anyway, so when obviously we were done, I had been planning Smoky Mountain Wrestling in my head on car trips for over a year. And I also, a friend of mine that was a DJ and later went to work for Deaf American Recordings, that introduced me to Rick Rubin, who was a great wrestling fan, an old-time wrestling fan. And we had got to be friends, and he said, hey, if you ever want to do something, and as soon as we were out of WCW, I called him up and said, I'd like to come to California and talk to you about doing something, and that's what we did. And it was at that point that you could still do wrestling. There was no internet then, so the average person was still not smart to everything that was going on in wrestling. And people, just a few years before that, in the Carolinas for Crockett Promotions and Southeastern Wrestling in East Tennessee, people had turned out in big numbers for professional wrestling. Unfortunately, I had thought when we first started that it had gotten as bad as it was going to get because it was the worst, business state for wrestling ever. But of course, then that was not to be. It was going to get even worse because WCW's product was getting worse on national TV, and Vince was in the steroid trial. And that's when his product started getting a little silly and going into a malaise, as they say, because he was distracted. And by 1995, when we eventually closed Smoky Mountain down, not only was WCW losing a fortune, but even the WWF. It's the only year, I believe, that since they've been in business under Vince, 1984 or whatever, that they actually lost money. They lost $6 million, as Vince used to like to say, out of my ass. And so, we started an old-time territory with talent that the people knew, and we did good in our major markets, Knoxville, where we had several sellouts and always did pretty decently. But we just couldn't get on television because times had changed since the late 80s. The deregulation of the television industry led to the infomercial, which would not have been allowed in previous generations because of the commercial time restraints and laws with the FCC. So all of a sudden, Vince had established that you had to pay to get your wrestling television show on the air. They would pay you to do this, or you could just sell the hour to Richard Simmons' Deal-A-Meal. So the cost of getting on television was prohibitive in some of the other markets that we wanted to go to, like Greenville, South Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, Lexington, Kentucky. And so we got too big to be small, but we were still too small to be big, and got caught in that wrestling recession. But as far as stars I knew Chris Candido was going to be a great talent. I'd seen him first time when he was 16 years old working for Dennis Corluzzo in New Jersey. And I had a pretty good idea about Al Snow. I also, when Dutch Mantell called me up and said, we got this big, huge kid that wants to come home. He's in Puerto Rico, but he's going nuts down here because everybody does go nuts in Puerto Rico, wants to come home to the States. Can you use him? Sure, Dutch, if you say he's good, yes. Glenn Jacobs, Kane. And that's not even, not to overlook Sonny. Tammy, who came down with Chris, and who I knew instantly, if she could get as much heat with the fans as she could with the boys, she'd be a big star. What a great talent. So, we had a lot of the headbangers. I was able to bring in D'Lo Brown. I knew that these guys could make it if they got a break, and I was trying to give them a break.
Sure.
Kevin Sullivan had a reign of terror in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, equivalent to anything he did down in the NWA stuff. I love Kevin Sullivan's spots in Smoky Mountain. Brian Clark came through there. But you also had a chance to be the hands-on man in OVW, Ohio Valley Wrestling. You made it much exactly like Smoky Mountain in the sense of it being more of a throwback territory as opposed to a minor leagues for a bigger organization than the WWF. And I know that you've been on record several times and explained, what exactly happened there and where they would kind of manipulate what you wanted to do.
My intention was to run a territory based out of Louisville, Kentucky, my hometown, and present the best talent and the best matches that we could, and also to train these guys to be the best wrestlers they could be for the future. And, with Jim Ross running the talent relations department, we had a great relationship because he came from the territory days, and he understood that he used to come down and have meetings and say, I don't care whether the rules in OVW are different than the rules in the WWE. The point is, we want to find out if you can follow their rules. If you can't follow their rules, why do we think you can follow our rules? Show up to work on time, do what you're told. And we had tremendous talent, not only that the WWF would sign and send to us, but also that would come to our tryout camps and seminars and that we would find on our own, and eventually they would in turn get developmental deals because they would progress at a great rate because we'd picked the right talent. The problem became when John Laurinaitis took over and decided that it all had to be about the WWF program, despite the fact that they did not own our company, despite the fact their name was not on the bills when they came due, and despite the fact whether it was better for our business in Louisville to present a quality product, he tended to look at us as a storage closet for bad gimmicks and people that they wanted to throw down there and see if they had a chance of doing anything. And they'd give them 3 or 6 months, and then they'd switch them and give them somebody else. A lot of times I would find myself showing up at TV and finding out that somebody I was using in the middle of a deal had been fired, and nobody bothered to tell me. And they would tell them not to come back and finish up, because then if they got hurt, they had to pay them till they got well. Jeez. So it was not a good relationship. But we, at the time, Ohio Valley Wrestling, for example, in 2000 and 2001, we did 3 shows at the Louisville Gardens, sponsored by Clear Channel Radio here in town, that drew a combined, I'm going to say, let's see, wait a minute, let me do some quick math in my head, 6 and 5, drew a combined 13 or 14,000 people and did over $150,000 at the gate for 3 shows in an 18-month period. That's in addition to the weekly Louisville shows that we were doing at a church gym. That was in addition to the weekly television tapings we were doing at our old location over in southern Indiana. And then when they closed the Louisville Gardens, we got the contract to present wrestling every other Friday night during the summer for a 3-month period at Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom, and became their biggest drawing ongoing entertainment event, to the point where they made the last couple of years of the deal a weekly event. And we had up to 1,500, 2,000 people out there some nights on Friday nights under the stars. This is all while we were running, between TV tapings, spot shows, and live events, approximately 125 shows a year within a 100-mile radius of Louisville, Kentucky, and training a lot of great talent. But unfortunately, that wasn't good enough for Laurinaitis and the bigwigs at the WWE, who decided they wanted to tell us how we should do these things. And as a result, the biggest drawing territory, actually at the time, and possibly still to this day, because Danny Davis could squeeze a nickel till the buffalo farts, the only full-time profitable professional wrestling promotions in the United States of America with television and a regular schedule are the WWE and Ohio Valley Wrestling. And it's been that way for the past nearly 15 years. Find another one for me now, and I'm willing to say I'm wrong, but find another one for me, and I will admit my error, but that's pretty much it. That's the case of it.
Sure. Sure. That's believable, too. I mean, you have to have a well-managed business, and I think the Internet would break if TNA was well-managed. So let's move on from there.
They're changing the website. You've heard about this. You haven't heard about this? TNA changing their website. Instead of TNAWrestling.com, it's going to be TNAWrestling.org because it's a non-profit organization.
No. I think
actually, they have come up on their new strategy for 2014. Dixie keeps teasing these big major ideas. She's finally hit on a genius idea that I think is going to turn TNA around in 2014. Starting January 1st, they're going to let all the fans into the shows for free and charge them to get out.
That's right.
Well, based on OVW, now there's a lot of guys. Well, not so many guys that maybe everybody knows, but the big names, Cena, Orton, Batista, even Brock Lesnar. There are a lot of guys that maybe didn't get a great crack to, move up to the big time. What were some of the talents there, some of the guys' names that you thought were just spot-on great guys and just never either got over with the fans or never got a crack to move up?
Well, there was a lot of guys that got over with the fans, just didn't get over with the office. The Basham brothers, Doug Basham and Danny the Damager, were 2 of our top talents in the ring and with the fans. They brought them up there and gave them a Linda Miles Shaniqua as a manager in a horrible gimmick where she was the focal point of all of the attention, and she was the absolute worst wrestling school student in my decades of experience of training wrestlers. and so they got shot down. And then Nick Dinsmore could have been a tremendous. As a matter of fact, I brought Chris Benwine one night to work with him at the Gardens. They had a 30-minute OVW championship match, and tore the house down. And the only way he could get a spot was as a mentally challenged young man whose shelf life was nil, because goofy gimmicks like that don't work, especially since he got over by outsmarting the smart people, and then they started making a buffoon out of him, and nobody likes an idiot who also is a buffoon.
Terrible.
Then the Spirit Squad, that was the St. Valentine's Day massacre of gimmicks, where they took four guys with potential, and Nick Mitchell always had a bad back and, probably wasn't going to go anywhere anyway, but Mike Mondo, Ken Doane, Johnny Jeter. Who else was in there? There was five.
Was it Dolph Ziggler?
Yes, and how did I forget Nick Nemeth? Dolph Ziggler managed to overcome that and eventually hang around long enough. Of course, now they're beating him to death because he's too good and he wasn't their idea. But Johnny Jeter was a young Ricky Morton. He could sell his ass off. This kid ended up. He moved from San Diego, California, to Louisville in an old Trans Am with everything he owned in the trunk of his car, and took a job at Chili's waiting tables to pay for his wrestling tuition. He got so good within a year and a half, I made him the OVW champion. He was one of our top talents, and they brought him up there and not only killed him dead, but also made him hate the wrestling business so bad he went back to San Diego after all that and quit the business, became a chiropractor, and probably the best thing for him. Matt Morgan, how did you fuck that one up, you morons? 7-foot-tall guy in his late 20s, injury-free, had a 3.8 grade average in college legitimately, was an incredible promo. We did a poll here of our fans one time, and they said by 3-1, Matt Morgan was the most popular wrestler we had in OVW. A week later, they called down and said, turn him heel. What? What am I supposed to do? Have him, disembowel Bambi's mother on television? How can I turn our most popular wrestler? So I figured out a way to do that, and then he became, by a 2-to-1 ratio, our most hated heel. And then they called down and said, put a mask on him. What? How can I put him? Everybody knows who he is. How am I going to? He's 7 feet tall. Why would I put a mask on him? Well, we want to see if it'll help his body language. I've never heard that before. Some idiot up there had mentioned somehow, or maybe Vince came up with it, if you put a mask on a guy, it helps his body language. I don't fucking know. So we put a mask on him, and finally it killed him dead. The people just didn't give a shit about him anymore. So then after they killed him for us, when he was an attraction, then they brought him up there and decided he was too good and too perfect, so they made him stutter, and that pretty much killed him on a mainstream basis. I tried to get him into TNA, but as we've seen, Jeff Hardy was the biggest star in wrestling, went to TNA, and suddenly people see him in the airport like, when'd you quit wrestling? So Matt Morgan, they botched. They botched Elijah Burke. They botched him. They botched, actually, if you made a list of the approximately 150 guys that either started in OVW, trained in OVW, or spent some time in OVW since 1999, you would find that the majority of them went to the WWE, failed because of the gimmick they were given, and quit the business entirely. Wow. And that says something. I just don't know what.
Sure does. Well, not to take a step back in time here.
We better take a step forward in time and go to the last question, because I have to leave very shortly to meet at Real Mick Foley. See, I'm using this Twitter business now. I'm at the Jim Cornette, by the way. Follow me on Twitter. I know there's a lot of people following me. I've seen them. They're in a Ford LTD with Missouri plates, but I've got to go meet at Real Mick Foley for his big comedy show this evening. So, but anyway, let's make it a good one.
Sure. Well, it was one that I never heard about. So again, I had seen some footage where Bill Apter had actually brought up something from your photography days. So you being, you've been everywhere. You just talked about, different people in the heat that they can, except for the UK.
Except for the UK.
Right? Except for there. I'm going there in February.
That's right.
JimCornette.com. You can find out all the information. But anyway, Bill Apter, wonderful Willie.
Yeah, the heat that the different performers can garner. Now, he mentioned, and I wasn't aware of this, he spoke of your photography days in an interview that I saw, and he mentioned that you were the photographer for the classic Lawler, Andy Kaufman program down there in Memphis.
Yes, I was.
Now, looking back, personally, I was always a big fan of Kaufman, and I think this came about because recently people were saying once again that he was alive. But, could you look back at that program with Kaufman and just some of the crazy reactions? It seemed like the heat there was unbelievable. Some of your memories of maybe, I don't know if you actually knew him or the man Kaufman, but just some of your memories of that Kaufman and Lawler program.
Well, I did obviously get to meet him several times, because he was there, and he was a very quiet guy. And I mean, at the time, that program stretched over a period of about a year and a half, but they would break it off and come back to it. So once I got in the business, he was around a few times, but then when I left the Memphis territory, they continued it somewhat. But at any rate, he's a quiet guy, very respectful of the business, not at all like an over-the-top, personality that you would think a TV star or whatever. But he loved the wrestling business because he had an appreciation for what the guys were doing. They were going out and getting responses, getting reactions from people, whether positive or negative or whatever. And obviously that's what Andy Kaufman was into. But I remember the first match, the big match, he had come down and wrestled women a couple of times and then got in the thing with Lawler. And, at the time, it didn't draw. Because wrestling was at the Mid-South Coliseum every Monday night, and the night that, April 5th, I believe it was, 1982, the night that Lawler wrestled Kaufman, the crowd was about 8,000 people, which wasn't anything out of the ordinary then. Actually, it was a little bit less probably than they'd done a few weeks before, maybe a few weeks after that. But he had tremendous heat with the people that were there because he just, not only did they resent him for being a heel and resented him for saying they didn't use soap and they ought to brush their teeth, but also because he was this rich Hollywood movie star, TV star coming in trying to ruin our wrestling. And when Lawler pile drove him and dropped him on his head, they were going to carry him out, but Andy laid there and insisted that they call an ambulance. And Danny Davis, my partner in OVW, was Lawler's manager that night. And, he fed Lawler the great line, hey, instead of an ambulance, why don't you call him a taxi? But there was an ambulance, location right around the corner from the Coliseum, but they were on a run, so they had to get an ambulance from somewhere else. It took like 20, 25 minutes to get an ambulance there to the Coliseum, and the people were just throwing garbage into the ring and booing him. They were knee-deep in garbage, and then they finally backed the ambulance right into the Coliseum, put him on the thing. The people were, I hope you die, you no-good son of a bitch. And they carried him out, and he went to the hospital that my cousin's wife, my cousins lived in Memphis at the time, and his wife worked at the hospital they took Andy to. And she came in that night. I stayed with him when I was in town. She came in that night and said, yeah, Andy Kaufman's really hurt. He's in a neck brace and blah, blah, blah. And he stayed there for 3 days to sell that thing. And, of course, wore the neck brace for like 6 months. And, but nobody knew that it was going to be remembered like that. And then the David Letterman show happened, and, it got bigger as time went on. And then finally, he died, of course, and then everything became mythological, and then they made the movie. So that's one of the most famous wrestling matches of all time now, but in April of 1982, it was another match on a Monday night at the Mid-South Coliseum that had somewhat of a bizarre element to it, and, who's going to remember it in 6 months? Well, it took of its own.
Sure, you got to appreciate that dedication out of somebody like that, coming into the business from, TV and whatever else that he was doing, the comedy clubs. And we actually have coming up, we're going to do a special where Bill Apter is going to join us, and because he actually introduced Jerry and Andy.
Well, yeah, Apter was the reason for the whole thing because, Andy wanted to do his shtick with wrestling women on a real wrestling show, and Vince Sr. at the time was way not interested in it because that's silliness. That'll kill the wrestling business. And then Bill Apter said, well, I know somebody down in Memphis. They'll do any crazy thing. And that's how they got together.
Sure. Well, Bill, as well as we also have Andy's girlfriend, who's portrayed by Courtney Love in the movie, Lynn Margulies Osgood. She's going to be on the program. We're going to do a special on his time in professional wrestling coming up. And she actually came out with a book not that long ago. She saved all the hate mail that he received, and all that he asked people to send pictures and requests to women to pick him. And the name of the book is Andy Kaufman, I Hate Your Guts. So I'd never heard of that you were, I figured when you had said that last time, doing the photography, but it never clicked. So I wanted to ask, I've never heard you speak on that. So
that was my national TV debut, because all the places that clip was shown, if you see the kid running around at ringside taking pictures, that would be me in my national television debut.
Very interesting. Well, we really appreciate you coming back here with us, Jim. I'll send you back over to Steve here quickly, and then we'll let you get off to your lunch engagement with the real Mick Foley, or at real Mick Foley, I guess it is.
At real Mick Foley, another guy we'd love to have on our show. Now, Jim, I'm going to give you just, if you could bear with us, about 3 or 4 names. We'll do quick 30-second name associations with some strange characters from the wrestling business I'm sure you've had a chance to cross paths with. A guy that we crossed paths with this animal a couple of days ago, and very memorable, and I hope to have him on our show. But let's talk about a guy named Manny the Raging Bull Fernandez.
Manny Fernandez, the Raging Bull, the Flying Burrito. Manny was a great wrestling talent. Dusty loved him. Dusty booked him in all the territories where Dusty worked. But the one thing I remember about Manny is I had worked with Chavo and Hector Guerrero in Mid-South, and I would strum my guitar and sing La Bamba at him, right? So then one night, Bull is teaming up with Hector Guerrero for Crockett, and as the Midnight and I are standing there, I did the same thing, and Manny kind of got hot, because he's like, what, are you making fun of me being Mexican? I was doing it for Hector, because he was laughing, but, so it was a close call there. You don't want the Raging Bull mad at you.
No, but you do want him to do shots of Jägermeister. We can tell you that firsthand. Now we go further from here. Let's talk about a guy named Abdullah the Butcher.
Abdullah the Butcher, once again, there's no characters. People say what is my character? Would my character do this? Bleh. Characters in wrestling come from, you got to be a character, like my mother used to say. Boy, he's a real character, and he was. Nobody looks like Abdullah the Butcher anymore. And I'll tell you what, he protected his gimmick, and he drew a lot of money for a lot of years, and he's still actually probably working. I mean, I haven't heard of any retirement tour yet, so we'll see what happens. But Abdullah the Butcher is unforgettable in the wrestling business for the face and the gimmick.
Absolutely. One of the most feared guys when you were a kid watching is Abdullah, because he was so unpredictable. Let's move forward many years into today's product, and let me hear your opinion on what's going on in WWE with Triple H.
Well, I would love to give you an opinion, but I'm clean and sober from WWE programming for several years now, and I do read what's going on, but it seems like it's more the same. In my opinion, he was never the star. He was always the guy that worked with the guy that drew the money, and he continues to push his boring self down people's throats. And, what more can I say? I haven't seen it firsthand, but at least he got a haircut.
Let's go back to 2 more guys here. One of the guys I know you spent a lot of time with. Let's talk about Yokozuna.
Yoko, he was an unbelievable athlete, and a lot of people will say, well, look at him, and why do you say that? Because the way that he could move at 500 and 600 pounds, if he'd have been able to control his weight and just keep that under control, I think he would have been one of the most awesome athletes, because all the Samoans can go. But he just especially had it. He had timing. He could work. If he didn't want to hurt you, he wouldn't. If he did want to hurt you, he would. But he was in control of it. And it's only when his weight just got completely out of control that it took him out of being able to have a great match with most anybody, especially those matches with The Undertaker. But what an athlete to be able to move like that at that size was unbelievable.
Awesome stuff. All right, and one more here. Let's talk about the original lineup of the 3 fabulous Freebirds.
They were revolutionary. But Terry could work, Michael could talk, and Buddy was kind of the glue that held them together, because that's how Buddy got involved, because poor Michael, the one thing was Watts put them together as a 3-man team, because he saw that Michael looked the part and could talk the part, but his his work was, to be generous. And so, Watts put Buddy in there, and they fit together personally and professionally, and they had a great run. Probably could have done a lot more if they hadn't been quite so wild when they were young, but they had a great run, and they were revolutionary.
That is fantastic, and an opinion shared by a lot. He is the author of Rags, Paper, and Pins, the merchandising of Memphis Wrestling. Go to his new look website, JimCornette.com. We're going to let you go. We know you got a lot on your plate today. Literally going to have some lunch.
I'm literally going to have a lot on my plate today. I'm going off my diet because Mick's coming to my hometown, so I've got to be a good host.
Awesome stuff. At the Jim Cornette on Twitter. Go vote for Dick Murdoch of the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. The Jim Cornette Experience, Fighting Spirit UK. You got a lot going on still, and you're nowhere near the wrestling industry. We just wanted to say thanks again for being on our show, Jim.
Thanks, guys, very much. I appreciate it. I'll do it again anytime.
Jim, we would love to have you're welcome here anytime. That offer always stands. We'll certainly be in touch. Always a pleasure to have you on, reminiscing about some of the classic stories. No one tells them better as far as we're concerned. And just wanted to throw out, we wish you the best of luck with the new website and all that material. Also with the new program, the Jim Cornette Experience, and that's Thursday mornings on MLW Radio. Hey, if you're ever looking,
Thursday morning and airs all week, so you can catch it at your leisure.
We would love to return the favor at some point. If you'd ever love to have Steve and the Scum join you, it would be an honor to be a part of the Jim Cornette Experience.
Absolutely. As soon as I'm tired of doing the show and want to get canceled, I'll have you guys on immediately.
Perfect. That's what we're here for. We're closers.
Yeah, we're good finishers.
All right. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Have a great day.
All right. Have a good day.
Talk to you later.
This is Jake the Snake Roberts. You listen to WGD Wrestling Weekly, man, with Steve and the Scum.
Okay, Scum, we are back, and I hope I don't sound like a whore, like a whore when I say this, but man, Jim Cornette is a fucking man. What a great interview.
Absolutely, never at a loss for words, Mr. Cornette. I just hope, you certainly don't sound like a whore, but let's just hope that in laughter and moving around in our seats here, speaking with the man, that nobody sprains a taint, as I believe he put it. It sounds like a very painful injury. You never know what you're going to get out of Jim Cornette, Steve.
Oh, totally, Scum. He didn't let us down. He certainly didn't leave too much on the table. Definitely some great stories there. I really thought it was interesting how the Hell in a Cell came to be and how he used different assets of prior matches, including the UT graduate there, Doug Furnace, the big strong man, how he ripped the cell door off, and how he used War Games as an inspiration for the cage. I always thought it came from that last Battle of Atlanta, that little mini Hell in a Cell. If you've ever seen it, it's like a 5.5 foot tall cage with a roof on it.
Absolutely. He never disappoints. Well worth the wait for part 2 there, Steve. A couple of things that we were touching on with him there that I found really interesting. Always good to hear that he has no love lost for everybody's favorite pizza man, Jim Hurd. How about the story where he talked about the creative meeting and the guys that are in there, and Hurd, after debuting the smashing success that was the Ding Dongs, wanted to break out the Hunchbacks, and they can't get pinned. And as he put it, the miserable old man, Ole Anderson, chimes in, like, yeah, put your guys in a match with me and Arn. I'll work on his arm for the entire time and make the son of a bitch tap out to an arm bar. There goes your unbeatable team.
Wrestling's cantankerous old man, I believe is the quote.
Right.
That's incredible. Yeah, tell me about, how about, was it another great story that he had about Dick Murdoch and Dusty Rhodes having a roommate that was a mule?
Yeah, that was great stuff. I think at one point, did we have a mule as a third housemate back on West 5th and Oswego at one point?
I'm not sure if it was a mule or an Arkansas Razorback, but it was definitely not a human being.
Again, I was always impartial to breaking out the donkey, but a mule, I guess, would work. Same difference, right?
Or a pale horse.
That's a whole different story and a whole different angle from. Believe that was from another man that JC touched on that he. I don't think over the years was too fond of. Always entertaining to hear him give his take on the Russo-Ferrara creative team, Steve.
Oh, boy. He seemed to have been happy that he only worked with Vince Russo as opposed to both of those guys.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, he never was a big fan of that whole thing that they pulled with the character that was kind of a spoof on Jim Ross. I've heard him in other locations talk about that he would have, believe how he put it, was punched Ferrara in his face had he saw him. I think they actually had an altercation at one point when they did run into one another over that. So anyway, never disappointing. The Jim Cornette Experience, great show. Give a listen to it. Be sure and check out jimcornette.com for all the latest from JC. Hopefully,
Yeah, that is a cool website, Scum. I don't know if you had a chance to browse through there, but just overall, a lot of pro wrestlers out there, but that is one hell of a website. Well done.
Yeah, very cool. Again, another thing well worth the wait. I know when we were back and forth to originally get him on the show, as he put it, as only he can. Give me a little time. We want to get this thing right and see how bad these people can fuck this thing up. So must be that they tinkered with it and fucked it up enough to his liking because it came out really well.
Yeah, totally. And one other thing out there, folks, if you're listening to the Jim Cornette Experience and you hear Steve on there, he's about to get canceled.
That's right. Looks like he's on his way out the door when he had a when he calls the number a Steven the Scum. But at least he has a good sense of humor about it, and for that matter, at least we do.
Yeah, that's right. What are you going to do? We're going to have fun here on our own show, and I'll tell you what, Scum, it's about that time. Let's do that Season 1 in review. This is where we're going to review our top shows and our listeners' choices, or at least some of our admins' choices, that is, down to our own favorite moments from Season 1. We talked about it earlier. We got it down to 5 categories. Scum, what's that first category we're going to talk about?
Yeah, well, we named our year-end awards kind of in fitting. If you're a loyal listener, you might understand some of them. Certainly Steve and myself will understand each of them from our own silly back and forth talks both on and off the air. The 5 categories that we got is the first one we're going to run down is the most controversial moment or comments made on the show throughout the first season, and we labeled this the You Want to Talk About Controversy Award. It kind of a tip of the cap to the Survivor Series 97 classic call that JR made as Bret Hart was doing the WCW in the air with his finger and smashing every piece of equipment in sight after the Montreal screw job. Then we'll move along to the funniest story told on the show of the year, which we dubbed the 60-Minute Broadway Award, which was kind of a tribute to our guest, the $1 Million Man, and Jake the Snake Roberts telling the story of Andre the Giant's gastronomical issues. Moving along, we have the Raging Bull Manny Fernandez Award, which we dubbed after our weekend in Winston-Salem at WrestleCade after spending a little time in the hotel bar with Manny. And that would be the guy, after listening to the program, that you'd want to sit down, belly up to the bar, so to speak, with. Then our sentimental favorite show of the year would be dubbed the Dick Murdoch Award, because if you haven't noticed, both Steve and myself are very fond of the work of what we feel is one of the most underrated and maybe not talked about as much as he should be wrestlers of the glory days, Captain Redneck. Heck, we started the show today with JC with him. He certainly agrees. By the way, get out there and get your vote for him to get in that Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, Dick Murdoch. And then last, but certainly not least, speaks for itself, the show of the year. Our favorite show, Season 1. It was a great season, a lot to pick from. You get Steve and I's choices. Some of our admins chimed in, I believe, and we'll run down those. So without further ado, Steve, let me start you off. Why don't you of the savages, as you like to call them, WGD Nation, Scum Nation, baby. Why don't you lay it on them with Steve's choices for the You Want to Talk About Controversy Award?
I'd be happy to, Scum. But before we go any further, let me make it very clear. We have this week what is called the first annual Scummy Award. So the first Scummy Award, You Want to Talk About Controversy, I'm going to give that to Buff Bagwell simply because the stuff he had to say, and at the time was so new to us, was kind of mind-boggling, talking about how Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan just slammed the door in his face when he went to a TNA show here in Atlanta, thinking that he had a possible, entry into TNA, according to some text messages that he had on his phone. Not to mention that, but also simply the fact that nobody will pick him up and nobody likes his character and he doesn't understand why. I thought all of that was just extremely entertaining and very controversial at the time. I think the winner, though, and this is Dan Warner's choice, he had two choices. He's the author of our logo, the WGD Neon logo. It is awesome. We're going to keep that for as long as possible. But Dan Warner's choice was either Ken Shamrock talking about being blackballed or Larry Zbyszko saying that all the TNA wrestlers are on foods. And I think in the end of the day, I think that one's going to win, Scum.
Well, it appears as though great wrestling minds think alike because Dan, shout out to you out in the Windy City here, my man. Thanks for all your help and being a loyal supporter and a friend of the show here. Love the graphics that he did for us. But yeah, my two choices were exactly the same as Dan's, in being that the Shamrock initial, the part 1 interview with Ken Shamrock that we launched, when he said, I've been blackballed from wrestling and I'm not sure why, was really the one that took us from a few hundred listeners to it got picked up all over the place on all the wrestling sites, and it just went nuts. That's why we got him back for the second one. So that moment, but I think overall the one that really went off the charts was the Larry Zbyszko, not only his comments about the TNA wrestlers being on food stamps, but surprising footnote to that were his comments about Sting being the luckiest performer in history, whatever else he continued on there. So I would have to say, Steve, given the feedback that we had from Dan and with yourself and I think you'd agree that the winner of the inaugural Scummy for You Want to Talk About Controversy is the living legend Larry Zbyszko for his comments on TNA wrestlers being on food stamps / Sting being the luckiest man in the wrestling business. /
Ric Flair being a, I quote, routine guy. So yes, we're going to have
and scared of him.
All right. So we're going to give Larry Zbyszko the first ever Scummy Award winner for You Want to Talk About Controversy. All right, Scum, let's hear what you have to say about the 60-Minute Broadway Award. What was your funniest moment from the first season of WGD Weekly with Steve and the Scum?
Okay, Steve. Well, I got two here, and that's kind of going to be a common thread, I believe. I think we're each going to have our honorable mentions, and just there was too much that we enjoyed, and I know you and I were stifling the laughter several times. There were several times throughout the year where I was just hoping to be able to compose myself in time to ask the next question on the program. One of those times, Steve, and this is going to be my runner-up, but I couldn't, for all I could do, I was just thinking, man, I hope Steve's up next, was when Ken Shamrock in his follow-up interview when we did, and he was dead on serious. I mean, he was spitting venom. He was answering, and he was to the point, and he was very passionate about what he was saying. So I didn't want to laugh. I mean, Ken Shamrock's a bad man, so I didn't in any way want to. But it just caught me so off guard when you asked him, what did you mean by saying blackballed? And his response was, I'm glad that you asked that. I would like to say that. And then he brought up the story about how Mark Henry, do you remember Mark Henry? Yeah. Well, he was in the back, and Hunter and a few of the guys shit in his sandwich. And just the surprise element of that caught me off guard. And I had to back away and mute myself from making a fool out of myself. But being the 60-Minute Broadway Award, again, there were a few great stories about the late, great Andre the Giant, but the one that initially came up with, where I coined the term 60-minute Broadway regarding Andre and his gas, was the Ted DiBiase interview when he talked about being on the elevator with all of the all of the Japanese packed in there with the, full elevator, and all of them being right at like nose at ass level with the giant, and him laughing, and DiBiase just saying that, it looked like when they scampered out of the elevator, it looked like Hiroshima. So I think that is my choice, and it was the namesake for the 60-minute Broadway. Now, Dan Warner once again chimed in with us, our friend Dan from Wrestling's Glory Days. His funniest story, Steve, was another Andre story, and that was one that certainly could make a case to win the award, and that was the one that Jake the Snake Roberts told about when Andre did the old hold on to the ropes and fall down with the seat drop, and he had the vibration, thought about getting up and giving him a paintbrush, but then thought better of it. So Dan also added in there, and I quote, "I love hearing the Andre stories. Most of them are friggin' gut busters," and couldn't agree more. I mean, what's your choice for the 60-minute Broadway award, my man?
I believe the exact quote that Jake used was, "There was a stench that could choke a maggot," which is just fantastic in itself. So that's great. I think that my choice for one of the funniest stories of the year has to come from Road Warrior Animal, and he was talking about one night they were scheduled to drop the AWA tag titles to the Fabulous One. The Road Warriors and Paul Ellering were backstage, and they were not enthused about dropping the titles. Paul Ellering had actually came up with a small angle along the way to somehow get themselves out of dropping the titles. But when they get to the ring, and Animal tells a story well about Road Warrior Hawk on our tribute show to Road Warrior Hawk. He gets in the ring, and Hawk looks over and says, "We're not dropping the titles. Listen to us and no one gets hurt." I thought that was the funniest story. I had to hit the mute button. I was laughing so hard. So either way, but I'd have to say, Scum, the overall winner of the 60-minute Broadway award has to go to Andre the Giant via Jake the Snake Roberts.
Absolutely. In the DiBiase one, it's a namesake, so if nothing else on a sidebar, we can give that one the hey, you had an award named after you, so it was a pretty good tale that you told. Steve, I want to chime in here, though. We had a couple of late entries here from another of our admins, and that was Chris Kyles. And he chimed in with, we had just spoken initially about the You Want to Talk About controversy. And he had a good one that we did not bring up, and that was his most controversial comment he felt was in our Lex Luger interview. And Chris said that Lex Luger's comments on his responsibility for Miss Elizabeth's untimely death, which is certainly a controversial topic. He went on to say Lex seemed very genuine and remorseful for the influence he had over Liz at the time and how different of a person he was back then. So very good. I mean, that very valid. We thank Chris for chiming in, another one of our pals from over at Wrestling's Glory Days. Always does great work on the site. He also added in a 60-minute Broadway, and his funniest story of the year is another great one that you couldn't get away with today, was Larry Zbyszko climbing through Bruno Sammartino's hedges to initially meet his hero, stalking the man. That is a funny story that I kind of forgot about. Again, so Chris, we'd like to thank him for his input as well, and keep up the great work over there at Wrestling's Glory Days. And continuing on, our next award stems from our weekend down in Winston-Salem, the Raging Bull Manny Fernandez Award, which is the guy, after listening to our WGD Weekly interview, that you'd like to belly up and have a few with, you know? And Steve, I think that I speak for yourself as well when I would say both of these guys, I'm not sure what your selections are, but my runner-up, just on principle alone, that how couldn't you want to be at a bar with this guy, is Road Warrior Animal. I mean, from the Grandma Bees stories to just their take no shit attitude, not only in the ring and the look of the Road Warriors, but Road Warrior Animal is my runner-up. And my first one is just due to his down-to-earth and how much he seemed to relate with us in the storytelling. My number one pick for who I think would be fun to sit at a bar and just reminisce with is Scott Hudson, former WCW Nitro announcer. He just came across, it was an early show. I know that we had a lot go on after that, but Scott just seemed like such a fan. And I also just, I'm back and forth with him, a fan of other things and other sports. I could just see us sitting at the bar with Scott and just having a heck of a time over a few. So my pick for the Raging Bull Manny Fernandez Award, Scott Hudson. Now, before I throw it over to you, Chris Kyles also added his choice in, and his choice was probably for obvious reasons and the same storytelling demeanor that I just spoke of. His choice was the Louisville Lip, Jim Cornette, Steve.
Oh, heck yes, Scum. Some great choices there. I had the same second place winner in Road Warrior Animal, simply because, the man's an animal. That's his name. Why would you not want to go to a bar with a man named Animal? But anyway, my first choice is someone that I think would be just a great pairing with Steve going out to a bar, and that is Bushwhacker Luke. How could you not want to go to a bar with that guy? Seriously.
Absolutely.
Just like Animal. There's just obvious reasons why you would want to belly up to a bar with Bushwhacker Luke. Maybe even by the end of the night you'll be marching around. Who knows what the man's going to say. But also, I think that we're going to have our first tie in the Scummy Awards, because not only did Dan and Chris vote for Jim Cornette, but we had a couple of late entrants here. I'm doing a little bit of post-production recording, and I wanted to add in that not only Matt, our Intercontinental correspondent Matt, and admin Ron chimed in here with a couple of different answers, and Jim Cornette seems to be their favorite to be sitting at the bar with too. So we have kind of a tie, because I didn't get their votes until after we recorded the show, but I did want to mention them. So the official count would be 2-2 still, Jim Cornette and Road Warrior Animal, Scum.
Absolutely, and let's just hope that they're bellying up to the bar and not bellying up on a scaffold for Jim Cornette's sake there, when being the co-winners. On a sidebar, Steve, ironically enough, and I know that you're aware of this, it's funny that your number one pick, because a year ago, just as the fans that we have been, and before any of this started, this never even would have been a possibility of a thought that we're naming the Raging Bull Manny Fernandez Award after sitting at a bar with Fernandez down in Winston-Salem and, reliving some great stories. I actually, a couple weeks back, when there was an independent show here in Clayton, North Carolina, I actually was sitting belly up at the bar with friggin' Bushwhacker Luke. So there you have it. And needless to say, he was, it was great to hear some stories from him. It was great to whatever. As the night wore on a little bit, there was a little bit of, there were a couple of ladies that were present, and you would not be disappointed that there were a few whoas in between what he was saying. And these girls, not sure exactly of their age, but definitely were not as old as we were. And they were trying to chuckle along, but I think they were a little uncomfortable by the woes and yays. At least no one got licked, though.
Did anybody do the Bushwhacker march?
You know what? I was really hoping that was when he appeared in the tavern. I was hoping for that, but I can't say as though I saw any type of a march out of the man.
I can only envision walking in the front door doing that march, marching around the bar, and directly back out the front door.
But again, my friend, we've come a long way, brother, to when you can sit down and we can name an award after having a few with Manny Fernandez, and I can chime in on your pick and be like, dude, I was actually sitting there with a dude a couple weeks ago.
As Kurt Angle would say, it's true. It's true. Anyway, we're going to move on to our sentimental favorite award, the Dick Murdoch Award. And I'll tell you, Scum, I think you know me well enough. It's pretty easy to know who I'm going to pick, and that's Jim Cornette. One of my favorite guys of all time growing up. Loved his sarcasm, loved his quick wit. I feel I've tried to model my own warped, twisted sense of humor and ability to insult people based off the prowess of Jim Cornette, as you could tell from the beginning of our show. But anyway, I thought that he is going to be the most fitting choice for me for my Dick Murdoch Award, but a close second place and a sentimental favorite of mine because he was one of the first guests. The first guest actually for you and me together, Scum, was Paul Ellering, precious Paul Ellering, WWE Hall of Famer, legendary manager of the Road Warriors. I mean, when we were finished with that interview, I know you and I were like a couple of kids just chuckling, couldn't even believe we had the opportunity to sit down and listen to some great stories from precious Paul Ellering. And, you know, that was kind of the interview that got us thinking that, geez, you know, we could do this on a weekly basis and make it entertaining and make it worthwhile for some folks to tune in and listen to some great wrestlers tell some good stories. So I think that Paul Ellering is going to take a very close second place, but my Dick Murdoch Award winner is going to be James Cornette.
Absolutely, Steve. And from our other adamants, had a couple of different views on that. Dan Warner had mentioned his sentimental favorite might have a little something to do with location, being that he's a Chicago guy. His sentimental favorite, his Dick Murdoch Award nominee was Road Warrior Hawk's tribute show, and he said just the walk down memory lane and the true emotion in that interview pulled at his heartstrings, which was, you know, just fantastic. So I agree. You know, I could see where that was. That was a pretty special moment and pretty cool that Animal came on to do that with us. I also know that Chris Kyles chimed in and said that his sentimental favorite was Jake the Snake Roberts. And he just said it was a wonderful interview with Jake climbing his way back up and his whole story being incredibly inspiring, which I couldn't agree more with. Great. Again, depends on who your favorite is. Sentimental favorite is what it is. Steve, personally, I went with kind of the method that you went with on Paul Ellering, which, yes, that interview was real special. I remember how excited we were when we got that booked and when we got on the air with it. But I looked at a couple of guys, and I'm not picking either of these as my first. I'm going to say it's a tie. Mark Bagwell, Buff, and just incredible. And my reasoning for that are similar, not so much personal reasons as much as for the show, because following that, both Mark and Justin, their want and their willingness to work with us in different capacities outside of the show. Justin coming down and doing WrestleCade with us and going out of his way and just being a hell of a guy and making it a great experience. And, you know, he's actually said that in this season at points he's going to come back on with us, and not only as a guest but as a co-host. I mean, just great stuff to make that connection with Justin and, you know, his honesty and just the great interview that it was in the relationship that was formed. And the same thing with Mark Bagwell. You know, both of these guys get a tough rap, I think, from a lot of the sites, just in the stories over the years, from years gone by. You know, Justin has been very open about that. Marcus Bagwell, maybe more than anybody, has been labeled and the stuff from the invasion, this or that. The guy's been a hell of a nice guy to us. He's been out of his way. He has no reason to be. He's invited us to do things with us. He's shown an interest in doing projects with us. And for that reason, Marcus Bagwell and Just Incredible, PJ Polacco are my two choices for the Dick Murdoch Award.
Awesome choices, man. Yeah, PJ and Mark have both been extremely cool to us and supportive of our show, and for every reason that you just mentioned. And, you know, quite frankly, having met them and worked with them at WrestleCade, you know, mostly PJ, he sat down, and we're going to talk about this here in a few minutes, some of our upcoming shows, but he really spent a lot of time with us when he didn't have to. And listen to this, guys. And Scum, you wrote a great article that was sent around the internet during our break about, I mean, the man drove 700 and something miles in his car when he didn't have, you know, the means to do so, when his flight was, you know, messed up because somebody screwed up his. So you want to talk about a very easily excusable absence. Hey, man, you know, the Department of Motor Vehicles messed up my license and now I can't get on a plane. I'm screwed. No, the man got in a car and drove 700-800 miles down to where we were in Winston-Salem from Connecticut. There shows dedication and shows the man's going to keep his word. So that's fantastic. And I'd be willing to forego any votes that I have to go ahead and send those to the Scummy Award for the Dick Murdoch Award. Buff Bagwell, PJ Palaco, thank you so much for being guests on our show, and I know we're going to see you guys soon. Scum, we're down to the last one, the show of the year.
So who do we go with? The Dick Murdoch Award is also a co-award winner there? Bagwell and
you
Credible?
made a great argument. It's not even worth debating. Let's go ahead and give that award to them.
I can live with that. I couldn't choose between the two for obvious reasons, and I'm down with that. The Dick Murdoch Award goes to Buff Bagwell and Justin Credible.
Awesome stuff. Well, like we were just saying, Scum, we've had some really good winners here so far in our first annual Scummy Awards. We're down to one last one, the show of the year. What do you got, my man?
Well, Steve, I am going to go for my show of the year to the one that I've found myself listening to more than any of the other ones. Maybe because of the content. Both of my guys, I guess, could fall also into the Dick Murdoch category of sentimental. But my runner-up, and certainly isn't because of content. I could have taken either of these, but my runner-up is going to be our interview with the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, and that is because he's always been one of my favorite performers. To go back through all those great moments and all of those, the Mid-South and the Georgia Championship Wrestling especially, and onto the $1 Million Man gimmick and even beyond. Ted DiBiase is an extremely close second. And my pick for our show of the year, the WGD Weekly Season 1 show of the year, was our interview with Jake the Snake Roberts for many of the same reasons. And just the way that Jake, even when he was a performer, he could do the talking. When he's on the interview, he can do the talking. So my pick was Jake the Snake Roberts for our episode of the year, Steve.
Oh, nice, Scum. Great choice with Jake the Snake Roberts. Always a great story. This is another good story, and it's getting better every year for him. And I voted for this person in this interview because he really changed my perspective of who he was as a person. And, shame on me for reading everything on the internet and actually believing some of it. But after having interviewed Lex Luger, I totally have a different perception of who he is as just a person, and I'm, very happy for him and where he's come from. And I hope and I wish him the best, and I know you do too, Scum. So I would have to say, my vote, my selection is going to be for Lex Luger. He really changed my perspective of who he was, with how candid and how open he was about some of the things that have happened in his life. And get his book if you haven't already. I got it sitting here on my bookshelf. It's a really, really good read. Wrestling with the Devil, Lex Luger. He's going to be my choice for the Scummy Award for Show of the Year. Like I said, just because he really, honestly changed my perspective of who he was as a person.
That is a great interview too, Steve. You can't. I could find reasons to pick any of these as the Show of the Year. This was a tough one to pick. The Luger interview was dynamite. I agree with you. He was fantastic. Just to take a check-in with our other admins here, Chris, much like myself, for the same reasons that he picked it for the Dick Murdoch Award, went with Jake the Snake Roberts. And for many of the same reasons that I did, he listed. And Dan chose, he said, he was surprised, much like yourself, for the same reasons, that he never considered himself that big of a fan, but he said his favorite was Larry Zbyszko. And again, for a lot of the reasons you said, just the great stories, and kind of changed his opinion on him. So that tally in, I guess we would have to say that the first annual Scummy for WGD Weekly Show of the Year, I guess would have to go to Jake the Snake Roberts in a very close vote.
Yeah, Scum, I can totally agree to that. Jake the Snake Roberts, our winner of Show of the Year. Let's move on to a couple of different topics. I know that the month of January is important to us, along with the Wrestling Inc. Radio. Looks like that's going to debut right around the Royal Rumble, which is a great time of the year for me. I love the Royal Rumble. We are going to do our first annual Royal Rumble review, Steve and the Scum's Royal Rumble review. And we're not quite sure what that's going to entail quite yet, but I know it's going to be Rumble related. We're going to talk about maybe reviewing an old Rumble, maybe talking about some of our favorite surprise entrants. You know, that's the one great thing about the Rumble. You never quite know who's coming through that curtain, even up until last year when Goldust and Chris Jericho made re-debuts. Place went nuts. So that's certainly a relevant thing, is who's coming through that curtain with a Rumble. So maybe we'll take a look at that, maybe review an old Rumble. That 92 Rumble sticks out as one of my favorites of all time, I think. Scum. But also we have some new guests coming up. So I wanted you to take a little bit of time to talk to our listeners about who's coming up on the next couple of shows. We got a really good lineup, and we wanted to start our new season with Jim Cornette because he was our most viewed and most popular episode in season 1. We are really excited to bring you that for season 2 premiere. But Scum, tell our listeners who's coming up next.
Yeah, Steve, pretty exciting stuff for the month of January. Obviously, our people had been waiting. Our listeners had spoken in volumes by the amount of views and listens for Jim Cornette, so we wanted to bring that as our first episode. You know, our first episode on Wrestling Inc. Radio as well. We wanted to have a big splash, so Jim Cornette was nice enough to come back with us, and we wanted to give Scum Nation what they had screamed out for, so he was our first episode of season 2. Now, next week, though, January the 12th, our next episode is going to be a lost episode that was recovered thanks to some tenacity. Now, never say the persistence doesn't pay off, folks, because if you'll remember in the season finale with Diamond Dallas Page, we went off at the end after being to WrestleCade at how disappointed we were that the recorder that we had was somehow, quote-unquote, misplaced, let's say. Well, needless to
Somebody stole it.
Yeah, well, hey, you know, needless to say, I wasn't looking for any answers. We weren't looking to point a finger at anyone. But after persistence and a tip of the cap here to the staff at the Winston-Salem Marriott, who was fantastic in helping, we got our recorder back, and we got the Lost WrestleCade show back. Woo-hoo! So on January 12th, we are going to bring you not only maybe the most emotional full-length interview that we've had with our guest from that weekend, just incredible. You'll have a full-length interview with him, but also why it was really special to Steve and myself is we were able to be backstage at the show, and prior to the matches we got to do some in character, like as though we were doing the interview pieces, say on a pay-per-view prior to when they were heading to the ring. And we have a wide variety of guests that join us for pre-match interviews in character, including Justin Credible, who was the referee in the Tommy Dreamer C.W. Anderson I Quit match.
That was a great match.
Matt Hardy, who went on to become the first ever WrestleCade champion in a ladder match with Carlito. Sanjay Dutt, TNA superstar, who was there and took place in a 6-man match for the PWX championship. The Raging Bull, Manny Fernandez, Robert Gibson of the Rock and Roll Express, and Buff Bagwell, who each were part of the Tag Team Turmoil 8-man gauntlet match. Legendary referee Tommy Young, who I know that was real special for you, Steve, that he took a minute to talk to us. WWE diva Jillian Hall, former diva, who was in the Lumberjill match. Johnny Fairplay, who was Carlito's manager in the championship match of the television program Survivor fame. We also had the man I like to refer to as the P.T. Barnum of WrestleCade, the guy behind the whole show, Tracy Myers. And then at last call, our friend from WOW, Women of Wrestling, Fire, who was also a part of the Lumberjill match. So we got just a slew of people on the January 12th show. Without missing a beat, we come back to you on the 19th with one that's real special to all you fans at Wrestling's Glory Days. WWE Hall of Famer, Master of the Iron Claw, Kevin Von Erich will be here on the 19th. And then to close out the months on the 26th, another man from that Georgia Championship Wrestling era, former NWA World Heavyweight Champion, the Hands of Stone, Ronnie Garvin, Steve.
Oh, that's a great lineup, Scum. Now, keep in mind, folks, January 19th, I'm really excited about this. Kevin Von Erich on the show, and then followed up by Ronnie Garvin in full-length interviews. Now, I know myself, the Scum, a lot of the guys, especially the admins over at Glory Days, they do a lot of research online, and they take what they do very seriously, and it's not a very common thing to be able to pull up a full-length interview with either Hands of Stone, Ronnie Garvin, or Kevin Von Erich. And one of the exciting things, Scum, about the Kevin Von Erich interview is that it's going to coincide with a 30 for 30 episode on ESPN, the worldwide leader in sports. I'm really excited about being able to do that. That's kind of a cool thing. And I always get a little suspect when it comes to ESPN airing anything about pro wrestling. There was an E60 a while back about, the Scott Hall thing, and it really painted a bad picture of him. And it would be okay if they did a follow-up with a little bit of redemption. But as far as it goes, that painted a real bad picture of Scott Hall. And, obviously real glad that he's on the mend as well. But, getting back to our guests, really cool stuff. We got a lot more lined up, too. Some more Hall of Famers, some more former champions all throughout our season. And it's going to be a great one. So, guys, get comfortable. Tune in every Sunday, of course. Wrestling Inc. Radio now. You can catch us on their iTunes channel as well. So a lot of great things happening with WGD Weekly with Steve and the Scum. But Scum, we're about ready to wrap it up, man. Anything more you want to add into our show before we head out?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. I think it's kind of fitting to sign off. We're real appreciative of everybody out there in Scum Nation, all the savages, as you like to always say. So, Steve, I wanted to wrap things up here and ask you one more year in review question, and it's kind of, I don't know, as one of our guests that actually was a co-winner of the Dick Murdoch Award put it, maybe leaning toward the fact that I always like to say, hey, we're over. We had a nice comment from our fellow Adam and Dan, who's been a great help. He chimed in here along with Chris, and we appreciate their input on the award show here. But Dan left a note on here, and I'm going to follow this with a question for you that we can both weigh in on to sign off here as our final year-end wrap-up deal here on WGD Weekly from Season 1. So, yeah, Steve, so what Dan had to say, and it's really nice of him, Dan, as we've said throughout the first season, has helped us out with some of our graphic work. He does really fine work. But he sent this unnecessary. He's a friend of ours. He's a big help. We really appreciate him and all the guys at Wrestling's Glory Days, everything they did. But I wanted to read this because it's pretty flattering given the names that he compares with here. He said, Steve and the Scum's back and forth banner is great stuff, and you can tell they spent a lot of their years listening to Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan, Vince and the Body, because the banter between them often brings me memories of listening to those classic announcers. Great work, guys, and continued success. Now, Steve, I can't think of anything more flattering as a wrestling announcers than to be to you to be the Gorilla Monsoon to my Bobby Heenan. And I gotta admit, many times when I dropped a comment throughout the first season and you fired back with a "get out of here," I thought about Monsoon too, man, or Vince and the Body. I mean, just classic stuff. Thank you, Dan, for those kind words. What I wanted to ask you first, a couple things before we sign off here, Steve. Wrap up our first season in review and head into 2014 strong. And we had a lot of guests that came on that we grew up watching, and it was pretty overwhelming at times that we had these guys to speak with on our program. So, and then I know we talked a lot about this, and Dan's comments, which are much appreciated, just like any of the nice feedback that we've received, made me think, Steve, what was your favorite guest that kind of had those same sentiments, to either said that they were a listener or enjoyed our show, or great questions, or whatever their positive feedback was? What was your favorite WGD Weekly moment where one of our guests, one of the superstars, sort of put over the show?
Well, Scum, as always, a great question. I would have to say Lex Luger. He made a statement towards the end of his interview saying that we exemplified what it was to be a good wrestling fan, in or about those words. I don't think that was the exact quote, but it was something along those lines, and it was really cool to hear him say that about us after, I know that took a lot of work to get Lex Luger on. And, the sound bites, I think they are the coolest things ever. I mean, we just spent the last hour talking about us and our shows, and it would seem to the first-time listener that we're all about us, but we're really the two of the most,
humble, likable dudes. If you ever met us at a wrestling show, we're sure to crack some jokes and, never act like we know more than you and stuff. And there's a lot of people, trust me when I say, when we go to these conventions, there's a lot of people out there that have that type of a demeanor. You're not talking to two of us here. We just love to have fun. We're great wrestling fans and love to have fun along with all the other wrestling fans out there. So I think that having listened to all these guys say you're listening to WGD Weekly with Steve and the Scum is probably the most gratifying. It's really, really cool and an honor to hear him say it.
Yeah, man. The Lex Luger thing, when he was saying it, I was like, wow, this is Lex Luger throwing this out there. A couple of points on a personal level. The Boogie Woogie Man, when he came on and said, I'm looking forward to giving you guys a hug, brother, and I love your show, was
which he did, by the way.
Yeah, it was out of this world. Bushwhacker Luke professing his love to the Scum way back when was one of the early ones that I remember. But I gotta say, for me, the Luger one as well, but to hear Road Warrior Animal on that tribute show when he said, when we gave props and to him and Hawk's legacy, and it was a tribute to the anniversary of the passing of Road Warrior Hawk after 10 years, and he said, guys, let me tell you what, Hawk would really love to be on here and doing your show, and the fans and what you guys stand for as fans. Coming from one half of the greatest tag team of all time, I thought that was pretty special in that moment.
Oh, man, you are absolutely right. I honestly hadn't listened to that interview in a little bit, and I totally forgot he said that. That's some good stuff right there, Scum. We can go on and on talking about how great and how much of a good time we had with our guests on Season 1, but I'll tell you what, folks, what's going to make Season 2 great is our guests. We have some of the best guests in the history of professional wrestling lined up for you guys. So sit tight, grab a ringside seat, sit down and enjoy us. Let us entertain you every Sunday. WGD Weekly with Steve and the Scum. Proud to bring to you a lot of different guests from the glory days of professional wrestling. Scum, anything else you want to add? It's almost that time, brother.
Yeah, Steve, I think it would only be appropriate if we signed off here with our personal favorite moments, like we were just saying, not where we were putting over, but having that interaction with these guys that we've talked about for years and years and watched and just enjoyed their work, and to have them on the personal level where we've gotten a chance to sit down, pick their brains, talk about all the classic moments, bring Scum Nation all the legendary moments from the mouths and the memories of these classic superstars. I wanted to ask you, and I'll be happy to return the volley afterwards, what was your favorite moment? What was your favorite Steve moment as far as interacting, not necessarily on the questions, but on a personal level? Because, most of the guys we had proved to be pretty personal, where, we shared a laugh and shared a chuckle here and there. I'd love to hear your favorite Steve moment regarding a guest, and then I'd like to chime in with my favorite Steve moment, and then I can return and give you mine. And if you did have any, I'm sure they were few and far between, but I'd like to hear your favorite Scum moment. So what was your favorite moment of interaction with one of our guests this year, Steve?
Well, I guess I'd have to go back to my Dick Murdoch winner, Jim Cornette, calling me out as a Yankee and trying to explain to me what the other side of the tracks is. I'm fully aware what the other side of the tracks are, and that's kind of why I said the joke to begin with. But anyway, I thought that was pretty funny. Jim Cornette calling me out as a Yankee, who I know he has a certain endearment for.
Very good, very, very good. And hey, at certain points, I think I know we say we broadcast from parts unknown, but I think you and I have shared an apartment too on the wrong side of the tracks, for what it's worth. But I would have to say that my favorite Steve moment is a tie. I'm a humor guy. I always like to see the lighter side of things. So I thought in that first Cornette interview, when you threw in, "It's fucking Vader," and he actually busted a gut and started laughing along with us, I thought that was somewhat surreal for as much as we've talked about that. And my other is when you caught Jake the Snake kind of off guard. When you came back in, we had to do the 2-part interview that was pieced together because he had a meeting there. And when you came back in, I don't know if he remembered exactly where we let off, but you did your intro and you followed it with, and it ended with, or whether Damien was biting a stripper's tit, and he started busting up. And I think those would have to be my 2 favorite Steve moments from season 1 of WGD Weekly. Personally, on a personal level, my favorite moment, and again, it's very, comes very selfishly, would be the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase interview, where I actually got to throw in there, for what it was worth, that Ted, I would just like to tell you that I certainly have a price. I could be bought cheap. And his response was that classic laugh, and, well, everybody does.
Well, man, I'll have to tell you, brother, I think my favorite Scum moment goes way back to that interview with Precious Paul Ellering, because it was very organic. It was live. And we're doing the show, and we're like, Steven the Scum, and he's like, Scum, is your last name Bag? Dude, we were both having trouble stifling our laughter after that. That was some hilarious stuff. But, on a serious note, man, I got to tell you that one of the things I'm most proud of is the line of questioning. Above and beyond that Scum character, we got a really good journalist sitting here at WGD Weekly, and that is you. You do a great job getting these questions written down. It's a lot of hard work and a lot of research, and you really need to know your stuff to ask some of these questions, and to have the guys respond with great question when we ask them is certainly testament to your work. So I wanted to say hats off to you for that, because without good content, we don't have anything. And with asking generic questions on an interview, you're not going to get a lot of feedback. So I think that, content being king, great job. Well done. Hats off to you, my friend. And I look forward to a great 2014 season 2.
Well, I appreciate that a lot, Steve. And I feel the same way when it comes to your work. We've been pals for a long time, and this thing coming together and continuing to grow, I look forward to seeing where it goes here in the second season and beyond. And I appreciate all the work that you put in as well to get this thing sounding top notch, and to put those fantastic videos together that we all see and that 30,000+ are seeing. I mean, so that right there speaks volumes for the work that you're doing, the work that we're doing together as a team. I mean, going back to Dan's analogy, of the whole Heenan Monsoon thing, if I could wrap us up here, kind of giving a nod to your half of that team. Sometimes it's not that easy to produce when we have all these rules and regulations around here to follow. You're completely out of control.
Well, I know I want 2 things for Christmas next year. I want a powder blue WWF suit jacket, and I also want a maroon one with velvet collars, just like Monsoon.
And a pair of blue, really thick sunglasses.
That's right. WGD Weekly with Steven the Scum. We're about out of time this week. Stay tuned next week. We got that WrestleCade episode. Week after that, Kevin Von Erich, WWE Hall of Famer, and then the Hands of Stone, Rugged Ronnie Garvin. Great shows lined up for you. Who knows what we got after that? WGD Weekly with Steven the Scum, your spot for classic pro wrestling. Thanks once again for tuning in. Scum, I'm out, brother.
Yeah, if I, again, can kind of give a hint as to one of our upcoming featured guests, I think we can sign off by saying this at the close of season 1 and heading into season 2. Diamonds are forever, and so are Steven the Scum, baby.